Welcome to Malcolm Noble Talks about crime fiction classics. Some crime fans may wonder why I've included John McNab in a series of crime fiction classics. Surely it's an adventure story, but stay with me and I'll explain to you why I think John McNab sits very nicely as a true classic of the detective form. John McNab by John Buchan certainly is not the author's best book. That accolade probably rests on one of his historical biographies, and I would put forward the work on Augustus as a strong contender. But his tale of hunting, shooting and fishing in the Scottish woodlands must be one of his most entertaining reads. Even if you find his style stilted, over-rich and just plain old-fashioned, I would invite you to lay that prejudice aside and lose yourself in the ease and coziness of John McNab. It is the story of three gentlemen who decide on a poaching holiday, challenging three landowners to frustrate their escapade. It is a game where reputations are at risk. There is some evidence that the novel was embellished from accounts of a real sporting bet. Buchan inscribed one early copy of the book to a Captain James Dunbar, acknowledging his reader's original adventure in 1897. Dunbar and Buchan's brother served in the same regiment. In Buchan's story, the three characters are Sir Edward Leithen, Lord La Mancha and John Palliser Yates. The first was once an Attorney General. The others are a Cabinet Minister and a banker on nodding terms with the Chancellor of the Exchequer. They are regular Buchan characters. Leithen has already frustrated one villain's attempt on world domination, and all three emerge as members of the dining circle who tell tales in the Renegades Club. In John McNab, they hatch their plot in the safety of their club and later plan the details in a Scottish lodge. Buchan liked to write about the comradeship of hunters. We can turn to an early story in Grey Weather, A Reputation, and there are plenty of others. In 1936, J.B. Morton, writing as Beachcomber, gave us The Queen of Maniquoy, an affectionate parody of this Buchan habit. The gentle joke works because Buchan has a steady, deliberate style that invites us to jump ahead. There are few surprises in Buchan's voice. The common element in all these episodes is the exclusive company of gentlemen of the upper middle class. Even when others are brought into the conversation, in John McNab the conspirators supposedly need the expertise of Archie Rawlinson's man Watty Lithgow. We don't know if we are to endure the phony bonhomie of the rich and useless speaking to the skilled but lesser men, or the sickening patronisation when the working class can only supply nuggets of little use. In neither case is there genuine sense of value. In 1936, 11 years after John McNab, Buchan gave us, in his Richard Hannay novel, The Island of Sheep, an excellent account of wildfowling on the Norfolk mudflaps. Here we have half a dozen pages of his very best writing. Critics who complain that Buchan's writing is not sensuous should spend some time on this chapter. But the early morning shooting expedition is preceded by an evening with local fowlers in a remote inn. We may be unsure if the patronising tone is drawn from Hannay or his creator, but almost inevitably it is there for sure. An unfortunate consequence of John McNab's essential premise is that class loftiness is emphasised throughout the novel. The barrister, the banker and the lord need to form themselves into a discreet, exclusive and secret circle. From the start, we know that we are in for a good dose of snobbery. Although Buchan leaves us in no doubt of their social class, we learn very little else about these three characters.
Lethan, for example, has reached the top of his profession, but we are told nothing of the scars inflicted by ambitious rivals. We do not know how the players react to, for example, any marital or domestic hiccups, financial threats, or the lasting wounds inflicted by overbearing parents. They have come through the public school system without neuroses. For gentlemen who have reached several worthy pinnacles, they seem remarkably free of any alcohol problems. Indeed, they seem to have no dirty habits, certainly no lechery or bawdiness. We cannot imagine what turns their stomachs or makes them sweat at night. We do not know them well enough for that. It is not enough to say that Buchan was writing adventure stories rather than incisive novels. That doesn't excuse the need for strong characterization. However, this weakness in Buchan's creativity gives room for the countryside to emerge as a character in its own right, and this is Buchan's strong point. He breathes life into John McNab's landscape. The countryside does things. It rolls, it dips, it slumbers and wakes. Hills and forests hide the players and then expose them. Buchan used this technique most famously in his popular book, The 39 Steps, but he used it more diligently, and I would say beautifully, in his writing about Africa. In John McNab, Buchan emphasises this sense of place by referring to fictitious locations which he had used in previous novels. The maps used as a frontispiece show that the country is on the southern edge of Buchan's location for his previous novel, The Three Hostages. The estate of McCrae is common to both, while other fictitious place names had already been used in a short story, Space, collected in The Moon Endureth. We can picture Buchan working from his own daydream map of the playground. The countryside is so vivid and detailed that many readers have embarked upon the game of trying to place John McNab's adventures on the Ordnance Survey. Most fans acknowledge Ardtornish on Scotland's west coast as the closest they can get to McNab's country. However, in an article for Countryman magazine in 1990, Kate MacDonald makes a detailed and interesting case for Lake Torridon, again in Scotland's northwest. To make the most of John McNab, we need to go beyond the book and look at the time in which it was written. Buchan wrote the story in 1923 and 1924. It was published in 1925. Let's consider what was happening to both the author and to England during that time. Noble talks about crime fiction classics. And you're listening to a special edition of Crime Fiction Classics discussing John McNab by John Buchan. Buchan's life has been told in several penetrating biographies. He was born in the Scottish manse, excelled at Oxford, and gained the patronage of several influential figures. He married Susan Grosvenor from a family which, in its heyday, had been one of the top families in England. But then the promise seemed to fail. He was appointed to save the Scottish Review, and it closed. During the war, he was given an office of information, but suffered many and repeated calls for his removal. Eventually, he lost his directorship of Nelson's, the publisher. He campaigned for public office, he lobbied for a knighthood, but both ambitions came to nothing, at least until he was appointed Governor-General of Canada towards the end of his life. Buchan's response to frustrated ambition was to work hard, and work hard he certainly did, blisteringly so. When we tabulate his working day and his annual output from the 20s and 30s, we cannot help but be amazed by the man's stamina and the flood of fresh ideas that he seemed able to marshal and manage. The second quarter of the 1920s were ripe years for a novelist. the old order was changing. Judgments were made against trade unions, unrest was building in the mines leading to the general strike of 1926, and Britain was on the edge of seeing its first Labour government. But Buchan didn't seem able to address the social issues in the manner of, say, the popular novelist of the day, John Galsworthy. Buchan lets himself down by referring to Galsworthy as Bilgeworthy. Instead, his writing seems to have been a vehicle to establish credentials to his new social class. While he maintained his feel for the countryside, which had filled his early writing, this was overtaken in the 20s and 30s by his need to evidence, through his writing, his upper middle class identity. We are left with a feeling that Buchan was good at writing and talking about things, but he was less good at delivering them. But one subject he did know about was publishing and the book trade. As early as 1907, he wrote perceptive pieces on popular reprints and the future of bookselling. He identified Trent's Last Case as a potential bestseller, and during the middle 20s he observed the growth of the English detective story. On the face of it, Buchan had a good pedigree for gaining ground in the golden age of crime fiction, but the form never suited him. The 39 Steps had a puzzle at its core, but there's no real detection in the story. In The Three Hostages, the novel that preceded John McNab, one of the characters sets out a procedure for writing a detective story, but once again, although Buchan emphasises the thinking process, the solution relies on far-fetched coincidence and no small measure of luck. In both these books, the writer is more concerned with the chase, an attraction that gives Buchan a place in the birth of the modern spy novel. The Powerhouse, featuring Sir Edward Leithen, The 39 Steps and the other Richard Hannay tales may not reach the standard of Riddle of the Sands, but they certainly are better than the melodramas of William le Cure, and they outreach the stories of E. Phillips Oppenheim, the most popular spy novelist of the time. But when we look at both the detective and the spy genres in 1923 to 25, we find that Buchan's place in the new fashions is an uneasy one. A. Milne had already published The Red House Mystery. Freeman Willscroft has scored with The Cask. Every year seemed to produce at least one enduring classic. They are still read today. Agatha Christie was growing in popularity. She would publish The Murder of Roger Ackroyd in 1926. But the nature of John McNab seems to suggest that after The Three Hostages, Buchan took a step back. The new detective novel wasn't for him, yet he had already demonstrated an understanding of the form and many of the skills required. When he embarked on John McNab, I am sure he had no intention of writing a crime novel. He most probably saw it as a comedy and an adventure story. It succeeds as both. Yes, law-breaking was at the heart of the story, but the offences were quite small. However, he ups the ante by making the consequences of failure severe for the perpetrators. The reputation, and by implication, their way of life, is at stake. So the weight of the offences gives the novel some legitimacy as a crime novel, even if that wasn't the author's intention. John McNab works well as an early example of the inverted detective story. That is to say, we know the identity of the culprit from the start. John McNab is a nom de guerre of the three gentlemen, and the story explains step by step how he is uncovered. On the face of it, there is no formal detective, but that role is taken by one of the heroines, installed by Buchan as a love interest. She gets to the bottom of things by working on the clues. The progress of the novel includes some sound deduction. The elements of trespass and secrecy, chase and intelligence trails and feints mean that John McNab has much in common with the spy story. Here again it is successful. It works. The identity of the secret agent, for that is what John McNab becomes in the context of a sporting bet, is revealed by peeling away his cover story layer by layer, trick by trick. Surely John McNab had much to teach the fledgling spy fiction of the 1920s. So in John McNab, Buchan, perhaps unwittingly, put right those elements, deduction through clues and discovery through sound counter-espionage methods, which are missing from and limit his Richard Hannay thrillers. But is it a good detective story? Well, it is honest and suspenseful, so we follow it to its end. And at the end, the clues and detection stand inspection. I'm not sure that Buchan intended to write a detective novel, but yes, I think it is a crime fiction classic that in 1925 took a good step forward. Thanks for listening to this special edition of Malcolm Noble Talks About Crime Fiction Classics. Can I just remind you that the opinions that I've expressed in this essay are my own, and they shouldn't be necessarily associated with any of the biographers that I've mentioned. Thanks again for listening. Hope to see you next time. Bye.